The house didn't hum. It held its breath. It was a place of grand halls that swallowed sound and long corridors where shadows pooled like dark water. Every surface was polished to a deep, cold gleam: the marble floors, the mahogany wainscoting, the silver that never saw a speck of tarnish. But, for all its shine, the place felt like a photograph of a home, not a home itself. It was a monument. A beautiful and terribly lonely museum to a life that was no longer being lived. At the center of it all was the man who owned it. Alistair Finch. He moved through the vast rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. At 50, he had the sharp, tailored look of a man who had won every game he'd ever played. But his eyes held a permanent, weary shadow. He would walk the length of the main gallery, his shoes making a soft, expensive sound on the marble. But he wouldn't really see the priceless art on the walls. He would pass by shelves of leather-bound classics, books that had never been opened. His home was a set of props for a life he felt no connection to. His evenings had a rigid, unhappy rhythm. He would pour himself a glass of amber liquid, letting the ice settle with a quiet clink, and then he would walk. Sometimes he'd end up in the library, staring at the cold fireplace. Other nights he'd find himself in the doorway of the grand ballroom. This room was the heart of the house's silence. In the center, beneath a towering crystal chandelier that never got a reason to sparkle, sat the Steinway grand piano. It was a magnificent thing, all black gloss and graceful curves, but it might as well have been a tombstone. For Alistair, it was. It was the physical reminder of the last time the house had felt full, the last time music had been made here. He never went near it. He just looked at it from the doorway, his drink in his hand, and let the silence press in on him. Living in this quiet world was Clara. She was the estate's caretaker, and at 25, she was a small, soft-spoken presence in a house built for loud, important people. She was not beautiful in a way that would turn heads at a party, but she had a kind of gentle beauty that showed in the way her hands moved. When she polished the silver, or the careful focus in her eyes as she trimmed the rose bushes, she was a current of life in a still, stagnant pond. Clara saw the house in a way Alistair couldn't. She saw the thin layer of dust that settled on the unused books in the library. She saw the way the light hit a faded photograph on a side table, a picture of a smiling woman. Alistair never seemed to look at. She knew the squeaky floorboard on the third landing and the exact spot in the morning room, where the sun came in just right to warm the floorboards. She was the house's quiet, steady heartbeat. Her own world was small and tidy. A small room on the top floor of the West Wing, a window that looked out over the sprawling, manicured grounds. She saved every penny she earned, and her only real indulgence was a small, second-hand keyboard she kept in her room. On it, she would play the simple songs her mother had taught her, her fingers finding the old, familiar patterns. Filling her small space with the one thing the mansion below lacked, music. Clara understood the piano in the ballroom. To Alistair, it was a painful monument. To her, it was a magnificent creature in a cage, an artist forced into silence. She would dust its glossy lid once a week, her cloth moving gently over the surface. She'd feel a strange pang of pity for it. She'd imagine the sound it could make, the way the notes would fill this huge, empty space with something other than echoes. She would briefly press her fingertips to the cool wood, a secret little hello, before moving on. Their paths rarely crossed. When they did, it was a dance of unspoken rules. If she was polishing the banister and he was coming up the stairs, she would quietly step aside, her eyes on her work, becoming part of the furniture until he passed. He never spoke to her directly, not about anything important. His words were brief and functional. See to the flowers in the conservatory. A guest will be using the west parlor. She was Clara, the caretaker, a name attached to a list of duties. To him, she was no more personal than the brand of scotch he drank. One evening, that dynamic was put on cruel display. Alistair was hosting a small gathering. His guests were people who moved in his rarefied world-sharp suits. Brittle laughter, conversations that glittered but never went deep. Clara moved through the periphery, a shadow in a plain black dress, clearing away empty glasses and plates. She was trained to be invisible, to anticipate needs without ever being seen. The party was a performance of wealth. She was part of the machinery that made it possible. As the group drifted towards the grand hall, one of the guests, a woman with too much jewelry and a loud laugh, gestured theatrically towards the ballroom. "Alistair, darling, what a shame. A piano like that and not a single note in the air. It's positively tragic." Alistair, who had been nursing his usual glass, offered a humorless smirk. His eyes, scanning the room, landed on Clara as she bent to retrieve a napkin from the floor. An idea ugly and born of boredom flickered in his mind. He lifted his glass in her direction, his voice carrying just enough to make everyone turn and look. He spoke not to Clara, but about her. "Ah, yes, a tragedy." He paused for effect, his eyes glinting with a mean-spirited light. "But I have a solution." "Play that piano," he said, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of the powerful, "and I'll marry you." The statement hung in the air for a second, and then the room erupted. It was a wave of loud, sharp laughter, the kind that confirms a social hierarchy. It was a joke at her expense, a way to remind everyone of the vast, unbridgeable distance between them. The millionaire and the cleaning girl. It was hilarious to them. A hot, prickling flush of shame climbed up Clara's neck. For a split second, she felt frozen, pinned to the floor by a dozen mocking eyes. But she had learned to survive in this world by becoming invisible, and this was just another test of that skill. She didn't look at Alistair. She didn't look at any of them. She simply straightened up the crumpled napkin in her hand and gave a small, almost blank smile. Then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her pace steady. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her fluster. Later, long after the guests had gone and the house had settled back into its deep, heavy silence, Clara was cleaning up the last remnants of the party. The air still smelled of stale champagne and expensive perfume. The mansion felt emptier than ever, the laughter of the guests leaving an echo of loneliness in their wake. As she walked past the darkened ballroom, the joke replayed in her mind. The humiliation was still there, a dull ache, but something else was there now too. A thought, a tiny, flickering spark of an idea. He saw it as a joke, a way to mock her. But as she stood in the quiet hallway, looking at the shape of the grand piano in the darkness, she thought maybe, just maybe, he had given her a key. The silence in the mansion after the guests had left was different from the usual silence. It was heavier, thicker, like the air was still holding the shape of the laughter and the clinking glasses. It was a lonely silence, the kind that comes after a party, and Clara felt it deeply as she finished her final rounds. She moved through the hallways, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, arranging flowers that didn't need arranging, her hands busy to keep her mind from replaying that moment. Alistair's voice, the sharp barks of laughter, the feeling of all those eyes on her. It was a small thing, a passing comment for him and his friends. But in the quiet of the empty house, it felt like a brand. Finally, she retreated to her small room on the top floor. It was a simple space, but it was hers. A narrow bed, a small wooden desk, and a window that looked out over the dark, sleeping gardens. This room was her sanctuary. It was the only place in the entire sprawling estate that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. Here, she could just be Clara. She sat on the edge of her bed, the fabric of her simple dress rustling in the quiet. The joke still stung, but as the minutes ticked by, the sting began to change. It wasn't just the humiliation that was keeping her awake. It was the piano. His words had been meant as a weapon, a way to mock her, but they had also done something else. They had brought the piano out of the shadows and placed it, suddenly and powerfully, at the center of her thoughts. He saw it as a joke. She saw it as a challenge, a dare. Almost across the room, tucked into a corner by the window, was her keyboard. It was nothing like the grand Steinway downstairs. It was a small second-hand electronic piano, its keys slightly yellowed with age, its plastic casing scuffed in a few places. It had been a birthday present from her mother years ago, bought from a thrift shop with money her mother had probably needed for something else. It was the most extravagant gift she had ever received, Her mother had been a nurse. A good one. The kind who stayed late to hold a patient's hand, who remembered the names of their children and their grandchildren. She had worked long, hard hours in a city hospital, her hands often tired and sore, but she always came home with a story. Not stories of blood or sickness, but stories of people, of a lonely old man who just wanted someone to talk about his dog with, of a young man terrified of his first surgery, of a family celebrating a clean bill of health. Clara's father had been out of the picture for as long as she could remember, so it had always been just the two of them. Their little apartment was full of music, not from a stereo, but from her mother humming while she cooked, or from the small radio that was always on. Her mother believed that music could fix things. A good song could mend a broken mood the way a warm meal could mend a hungry stomach. When Clara showed an interest in the piano, her mother had scraped together the money for the second-hand keyboard and for lessons with a retired teacher who lived in their building. Music is a language. Clara, her mother used to say, sitting beside her on the small bench as Clara fumbled through her scales. It's how we talk about the things we can't find the words for. The sad things, the happy things, the things we're too scared to say out loud. Clara never became a concert pianist. Life got in the way. Her mother got sick, and the world of bills and responsibilities took over. The music lessons stopped. The keyboard was put away for a time. But she never forgot how to play. She could still read music, but more than that, she remembered the songs her mother had taught her. They were simple tunes, folk songs, and lullabies, but they were tied to memory so strong that playing them was like opening a photo album in her mind. One song, in particular, was a constant presence in her memory. It was a lullaby, unlike any other she knew. It was haunting and beautiful, with a melody that felt like a gentle ache. She remembered the day her mother came home humming it. She had been caring for a young woman, a mother herself, who had just lost her newborn baby. The woman was completely heartbroken, unable to speak or even cry. All she could do was lie in her hospital bed and hum this quiet melody over and over again. She didn't say a word for days. Her mother had told Clara, her own voice soft and sad. Just that little song. She must have written it for the baby, I think. I didn't dare ask. I just sat with her, and sometimes I'd hum with her, just so she knew she wasn't alone. Her mother learned the melody from those days of quiet humming, and she passed it on to Clara. It wasn't a happy song, but it was full of a deep, powerful love. It was the sound of a mother's sorrow, a love so big it hurt. Her mother had taught it to her, not as a sad story, but as a reminder of human connection, of the quiet strength it takes to comfort someone in their deepest pain. Sitting on her bed in the mansion, Clara found herself humming it softly. The melody felt so real, so close in the quiet of her room. She stood up and walked over to the keyboard. She ran her fingers over the cool plastic keys, a familiar comfort. Her mother's words came back to her. It's how we talk about the things we can't find the words for. She thought of Alistair Finch, his cruel joke. The vast, empty house. The piano in the ballroom, sitting in the silence like a memory. She thought of her mother and the grieving woman from the hospital all those years ago. They were all connected, she realized, by this one song. A song about loss. A song about love. A song that was meant to be shared. Her hands, which had been polishing silver and trimming roses all day, found their position on the keys. She didn't need sheet music. This song was etched into her soul. She took a slow breath, and she began to play. The sound of the electronic keyboard was thin and quiet compared to what she was imagining. But the notes were true. The melody filled her small room, pushing back the heavy silence of the mansion. As she played, the notes no longer felt like just notes. They felt like a story. She was playing for the woman she never met, for the baby who was lost too soon. She was playing for her own mother, for all the quiet compassion she had given the world. And, in a strange way, she was playing for the lonely man downstairs. For the sorrow she could feel hanging in his house like a fog. The joke was not a proposal. She knew that. It was an insult. But maybe, just maybe, it was also a key, a permission slip. The thought began to form in her mind, clear and bright. What if? What if she walked into that ballroom, sat down at the Grand Steinway, and played this song? What would happen? Would he fire her on the spot? Most likely. But the thought of the music filling that beautiful, dead room was too powerful to ignore. He wanted a joke. He wanted a spectacle. She could give him one. But it would be her kind of spectacle. It wouldn't be funny. It would be true. She played the lullaby one more time, her fingers moving with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. The melody was no longer just a memory from her past. It was a bridge. It connected her mother's kindness to her own quiet courage. It connected her small, simple life to the vast, complicated grief of the man who employed her. As the last note faded into the quiet of her room, Clara made a decision. She would do it. She would play that piano. The next few days felt like a long, drawn-out breath. The mansion fell back into its usual rhythm. The evening party, a fading ripple in its deep, still pool of silence. Alistair Finch, having forgotten his cruel little joke as quickly as he had made it, returned to his slow, ghostly wandering from room to room. He didn't notice anything different about Clara. To him, she was still just the quiet caretaker, a part of the background, a detail in the landscape of his lonely life. But something inside Clara had changed. She moved through her duties with a new kind of focus, her mind always turning back to the piano. The thought of walking into the grand ballroom and sitting down at that, Steinway felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. It was a line she had never considered crossing. It was insubordination, an act of defiance that could cost her the only stable job she had ever known. But the idea of the song, that one special melody, being locked away inside her while the magnificent piano sat in silence, felt wrong. Her mother's voice was a constant echo in her mind. It's how we talk about the things we can't find the words for in this house. This man had so many unspoken words hanging in the air. She waited for her moment. It had to be a time when the house was truly empty, when Alistair was either out or locked deep in his study, far enough away that he wouldn't hear her at first. She needed the courage to just start. Finally, a week after the party, the chance came. A sleek black car was waiting at the front entrance in the late afternoon. Alistair, dressed in a dark suit and looking even more somber than usual, was leaving for some kind of business dinner. He didn't even acknowledge her as he passed her in the hall, his mind already miles away. As soon as the car pulled away, a strange hush fell over the estate. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds in the garden and the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Clara finished her tasks with an energy she hadn't felt in a long time. Her heart beat a little faster with every wiped countertop, every polished doorknob. The idea was no longer just a thought. It was a plan. Night fell, and the mansion grew even quieter. The tall windows of the first floor became dark mirrors, reflecting the moonlight and the shadows of the gardens. Clara finished her work and went to her room, but she didn't get ready for bed. She took a deep, steadying breath. She wasn't just going to think about it anymore. She changed out of her work clothes into a simple, comfortable dress. She didn't know why. It just felt right. Like she was about to do something important, something that required more than a uniform. She left her room and walked down the main staircase, her feet making no sound on the plush runner. Every creak of the old house sounded like a shout in the silence. She felt like an intruder, which in a way she was. She wasn't supposed to be here. The front hall was dark and vast, the portraits on the walls looking like stern judges in the dim light. She turned the corner and walked down the long hallway that led to the grand ballroom. The tall double doors were slightly ajar. She pushed one of them open, just enough to slip inside. The room was breathtaking and intimidating. The high ceiling seemed to stretch up into darkness. The crystal chandelier, with all its lights off, was a huge, complex sculpture, catching the faint moonlight from the tall windows. And there it was, the Steinway. It sat in the center of the polished wooden floor, looking almost regal. Like a king holding court in an empty kingdom, Clara walked slowly towards it, her footsteps muffled by the sheer size of the room. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood of the lid. It was even more beautiful up close. She lifted the heavy lid, propping it carefully on its stick. The silence of the room seemed to deepen, as if the piano itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The keys, pristine and white, seemed to glow in the dim light, She sat down on the bench. The velvet cushion was soft and worn from years, maybe decades, of disuse. For a moment, she just sat there. Her hands rested in her lap, and she felt the weight of the moment. This was the point of no return. If he found her, if he heard her, this was it. Her job, her home, everything could be gone in an instant. But the thought of leaving without playing, of letting this one chance slip away, was worse. She thought of her mother again, and of the grieving young woman. This song wasn't hers to keep. It was a story that needed to be told. She thought of the cold, sad atmosphere of this entire house. It needed this music even if it didn't know it. She placed her fingers on the keys. They felt different from her small keyboard at home. They were heavier, more solid, full of a potential that she could feel through her fingertips. They were ready. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first note was a shock. The sound that came from the Steinway was nothing like the thin, electronic sound from her room. It was full and rich, with a deep, warm resonance that seemed to roll across the floor and fill the entire cavernous space. It was a living, breathing sound. The melody, the haunting lullaby, came to life in a way it never had before. Each note hung in the air, perfect and clear, before melting into the next. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was coaxing a story out of the heart of the piano. The music poured out of her, a current of pure emotion. It was sad, but not just sad. It was full of a profound, aching love. It was the sound of a mother's lullaby for a child she would never watch grow up. It was the sound of comfort given in a time of ultimate sorrow. Clara played with her eyes closed, lost in the melody, her fingers moving with a memory that was deeper than just her own. She was playing for her mother, for the woman in the hospital, for all the quiet, unspoken heartaches in the world. She was also, in a way she couldn't quite explain, playing for the man who owned this house, playing for the source of the deep, cold sadness she felt in its walls. The song filled the ballroom, but it didn't stay there. The music was too strong, too alive to be contained. It seeped under the doors, drifted up the grand staircase, and wound its way through the silent, empty halls. It found the narrow corridors and the high-ceilinged rooms, touching the dusty books and the cold, unlit fireplaces. It was a sound the house hadn't heard in a generation, a sound that felt like it belonged there, a sound that felt like it was finally coming home. Upstairs? In his study, Alistair Finch was staring at a financial report, the numbers and charts blurring into meaningless shapes. He was trying to lose himself in the cold logic of business. But tonight, it wasn't working. The house felt different, colder. The silence felt heavier. He was about to pour himself another drink when he heard it. At first, it was so faint he thought he was imagining it. A sound carried on the air, a melody. He froze, his hand hovering over the crystal decanter. He listened. It was a piano. Someone was playing a piano in his house. A flicker of anger went through him. Who would dare? But as the sound grew clearer, the anger dissolved, replaced by a feeling so profound it was almost physical. A jolt of pure, ice-cold shock. He knew that song. It wasn't a popular tune. It wasn't something you would hear on the radio. It was her song. Emily's. It's Emily. The song she had written, the melody she had hummed to their daughter, early in the handful of hours they had with her. It was the sound of his wife's love, her joy and her sorrow, all rolled into one haunting melody. He had not heard it since the day she died. He had forbidden it, erased it, locked the memory of it away so tightly that he thought it had vanished forever. And now here it was. A ghost. A beautiful, impossible ghost was moving through his house, playing his wife's secret song. He didn't think. He didn't question. He propelled himself out of his chair, the forgotten report sliding to the floor. He ran out of his study, his shoes pounding on the floorboards, a sound this house hadn't heard in years. He didn't know who was playing it, or how, or why. All he knew was that he had to get to the source. He had to get to the music. He ran down the hallway and took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sound of the lullaby growing louder with every step, pulling him towards the one room in the house he had avoided for years, the ballroom. The sound of his own feet hammering against the polished wood of the staircase was a violent intrusion, clumsy, noisy disruption to the pure, flowing notes of the melody. The music was a gentle wave. His running was a frantic, desperate storm. The ballroom doors were at the end of the long hallway. The sound was pouring from the crack between them, clearer and more powerful with every step he took. It was beautiful, and it was agonizing. It was the sound of his own heart being ripped open and held up to the light. He reached the doors, threw one open, with such force that it crashed against the inner wall. The sound of the bang echoing through the room. A sudden, ugly punctuation in the middle of a sentence. The music stopped. The sudden silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute and deafening. It was heavier and more profound than the silence that had lived there before. It was a silence filled with shock, and there she was. Clara. She was sitting on the bench at the piano, her back to him. Her hands were resting on the keys, frozen in place. In the dim light filtering through the tall windows, she was just a small, still figure, a silhouette against the grand black shine of the Steinway. For a long moment, Alistair just stood there in the doorway, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to connect the pieces of an impossible puzzle. It was her, the caretaker, the quiet, invisible girl from the edges of his rooms. She was the one playing his wife's song. The thought was so absurd, so beyond any realm of possibility, that he felt a surge of irrational anger mixed with a dizzying confusion. He saw her flinch at the sound of the door, and she slowly began to turn on the bench. Her face, when he saw it, was not what he expected. There was no smirk, no defiance, no hint of a prank. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Something like concern. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, utterly unprepared for the arrival of a freight train. He found his voice. But it wasn't the voice of the powerful, cynical man who had made a joke a week ago. It was a raw, shredded thing, a sound he barely recognized as his own. It was a choked whisper, a plea from the deepest part of a wound he thought had scarred over. "Stop," he said. The single word hung in the air between them. It was not a command. It was a beg, her hands lifted from the keys as if they were burned. She rose slowly from the bench, her movements stiff with a fear that was palpable. She probably thought he was going to strike her, fire her, have her thrown out. He saw it in the way she stood, bracing herself. He took a step into the room, his eyes fixed on her, his mind still reeling. "How?" he asked, his voice cracking on the word. He wasn't asking about her technique. He wasn't asking if she'd stolen sheet music. He was asking the impossible question that was burning a hole through his sanity. "How do you know that song?" The question, stripped of all its anger and power, seemed to hang in the air, asking for a story, not a confession. Clara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw past the tailored suit and the imposing figure. She saw the man underneath the man whose eyes were red-rimmed and swimming in a pain so deep it was like looking into an abyss. The master of the house was gone. In his place was a man who was broken. The fear in her chest loosened its grip. This was not a confrontation between a boss and an employee. This was something else entirely. Something much more human. She saw his vulnerability, and it shattered the invisible wall that had always been between them. "My mother," she said, her own voice quiet but steady. "My mother was a nurse." Alistair just stared, waiting, his entire being focused on her words. She took a small breath and told him. She told him about her mother, who worked in a city hospital for years. She told him about the little second-hand keyboard and the simple, powerful belief that music could speak when words failed. She told him how her mother had learned the melody, not from a book, but from a patient, a young, grieving mother who had lost her baby. "She never knew her name," Clara said softly, her gaze steady on his. She just said the woman was heartbroken. She couldn't speak. She could only hum. "My mother sat with her, and she learned the song that way." She thought. She thought it was the only thing holding the woman together. "She passed it on to me. It's the only song from that time I can remember perfectly." As she spoke, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The chasm of class and status, the difference in their ages, The entire structure of their relationship as employer and employee, it all dissolved into thin air. They were no longer a millionaire and his caretaker. They were just two people standing in a room, connected by a single, fragile thread of melody. Alistair stood frozen. He saw it all so clearly. The grieving woman in the hospital was Emily, his Emily. After they lost Lily, she had fallen into a despair so deep he didn't know how to reach her. She had stayed for a few days in a private hospital, a place she insisted on going so he wouldn't have to see her fall apart. He remembered a kind nurse he would see in the hallways, a woman with a gentle face who always offered him a small, sad smile. He never knew her name. He never knew that in those darkest hours, when he felt so helpless, someone had been sitting with his wife, sharing her sorrow, learning her song. The melody he had heard wasn't a ghost. It was a message. It was a kindness, passed from one woman to another across decades, traveling through the hands of her daughter, and finally finding its way back to him here. In the tomb he had built for his grief, the Zangu wall he had spent years constructing around his heart. Wall after wall of stoicism, indifference, and cynicism crumbled. It didn't just crack. It turned to dust. A sound came from him, a deep, shuddering gasp, and then the dam broke. He wasn't the master of the house anymore. He was just a man who had lost his wife and his baby, a man who had been suffocating in his own silence for too long. He sank to his knees, right there on the polished floor of the ballroom, and wept. It wasn't a quiet, dignified weeping. It was the loud, messy, gut-wrenching sob of a pain that had been held down for an eternity. The years of unshed tears, of unspoken grief, poured out of him in a torrent. He was crying for Emily, for Lily, for the wasted years of loneliness, and for the stunning, impossible mercy of hearing her song again. Clara watched him, her own eyes filling with tears. She didn't move to comfort him. She didn't know if she should. This was not her place. She just stood there, a quiet witness, letting him have this moment. She had unlocked the door, but he was the one who had to walk through it. The music had stopped, but the room was filled with a more powerful sound. Now the sound of a heart finally breaking open. And in that sound, there was the beginning of something else. A possibility. A change. A note of hope. The quiet that followed Alistair's breakdown was not the same as the house's usual silence. It wasn't empty or heavy. It was soft and clean and full of the air of things that had finally been said. Alistair remained on his knees for a long time, his head in his hands, the shuddering sobs gradually subsiding into quiet, exhausted breaths. Clara stood a few feet away, a silent, steady presence, not intruding, not leaving, just letting the moment be. She didn't know what to do, but she knew that doing nothing was the right thing. Finally, he stirred. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so simple and human it was almost strange to see on him. He looked up not at Clara, but at the piano. For the first time, his gaze wasn't one of pain or avoidance, but of something that looked like recognition, like seeing an old friend he thought he'd lost forever. He pushed himself slowly to his feet, his movements stiff and clumsy, as if he'd forgotten how to use his own body. He didn't look at her directly. "You should go," he said, his voice raspy and raw. It wasn't an order. It was a quiet, necessary statement. Clara gave a small, understanding nod. She turned and walked out of the ballroom, closing the heavy doors gently behind her, leaving him alone with the piano and the ghosts that were no longer quite so terrifying. She went back to her small room, her own heart aching with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. She didn't know if she still had a job. For the first time since she'd come to work at the estate, she wasn't afraid of that uncertainty. She felt a profound sense of peace. She had done what she felt she had to do, and the world, for a moment, felt right. The next morning, the house was different. Clara woke up not to the usual oppressive silence, but to the faint, distant sound of someone moving around downstairs. She went about her routine with a sense of caution, expecting to be called into the study at any moment and dismissed. But the call never came. As she worked, she kept expecting to see Alistair, but he remained in his study. Still, the air felt lighter, less crowded with unspoken feelings. It was late in the afternoon when she saw him. He was standing in the main hallway looking at an old photograph on a side table. It was a picture of a smiling woman with bright eyes and hair that caught the sun, his wife. He was just looking at it, not with the pained avoidance of the past, but with a quiet, tender expression. He heard her approach and looked up. Their eyes met. There was no anger in his face, no shame. There was just a deep, quiet weariness and a flicker of something new gratitude. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name with anything other than a detached instruction. "Yes." "Sir," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "The piano. It sounds better when you play it." It wasn't a question. It was a simple, honest observation. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. "It's a beautiful instrument," she replied. That evening, as she was finishing up, he found her in the library, tidying the shelves. Would you be willing to play for me again?" he asked. The question was so full of vulnerability, so unlike the man who had made a joke at her expense just a week ago, that it took her breath away. "Of course," she said, her voice barely a whisper. So it began. Every evening, after the work was done, Clara would sit at the Steinway and play. At first, she was hesitant, but Alistair would just sit in one of the high-backed chairs near the window, listening with his eyes closed. He didn't ask for his wife's song again, and she didn't play it. She played other things, simple folk songs, classical melodies she remembered from her lessons, anything that felt gentle and true. The music didn't just fill the ballroom anymore. It seeped into every corner of the house, chasing away the lingering cold. The mansion was no longer a mausoleum. It was becoming a home again, a home where memories could be visited, not just buried. One evening, after she finished a particularly soft piece, he spoke. "Her name was Emily," he said, his voice soft. "The baby. Her name was Lily." Clara nodded, letting the name settle into the quiet room. He began to talk. He told her stories about Emily, about her laugh, the way she loved to dance in the kitchen, her dreams of opening a small school for music. He talked about Lily, about the impossibly small fingers and the brief, perfect moments they had with her. He was sharing his most sacred, painful memories, not with a therapist or an old friend, but with her. With Clara, the caretaker had become a confidant. The change in Alistair was visible to everyone who knew him. The hard, cynical shell had fallen away, revealing a man who was kinder, more present. He started taking walks in the gardens Clara tended, asking her about the different flowers. He started reading the books from his own library. One day he came to her and told her he had an idea. "For years my money has just been a number in a bank account," he said. "It's done nothing but buy me silence. I want to change that. I want to honor Emily. I want to use the money to give other people what music gave her hand, what it gave me last night, a voice." And so, the Emily Finch Music Grant was born. It was a foundation with a simple mission: to fund music lessons and instruments for children in communities that couldn't afford them. It was a way to turn the silence of a grand piano into a chorus of new voices, and Clara was at the heart of it. Alistair didn't just give her a bonus. He asked her to help him run it. She became its first director, using her own experience and her mother's gentle wisdom to shape its mission. She found applications, spoke with parents, and helped choose the first group of children who would receive the gift of music. The caretaker was now a partner, a creator. She still lived on the estate, but her life was unrecognizable. The small keyboard in her room was now joined by a new, beautiful piano that Alistair had bought for her, placed in a sunny room he had set up just for her to practice in. They were not employer and employee anymore, and they certainly were not what his cruel joke had suggested. They were two people whose lives had been unexpectedly and irrevocably intertwined by a single melody. He never did marry her, of course. The joke had been a cruel thing, but it had opened a door that led somewhere far more meaningful than any contract or ceremony. It had led to healing, to friendship, to a shared purpose. It had led to a house filled with music again. The joke, which had been meant to be a small, ugly moment of power, had accidentally orchestrated the most profound kindness of his life. It had changed everything. The millionaire and the caretaker had found something far more immutable than all the money in the world. They had found a way to fill a silent house with the sound of a second chance.